Live. Meeting is now streaming live on custom live streaming service. Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see those of you who have made it into the room. And I believe there are going to be folks who are watching via the stream. So welcome to you all as well. My name is Liz Derrington, and I am going to be your guide this evening through the wild world of mid-century Hollywood and, well, I don't need to improvise this. I have it all written down. So join me, won't you, as I share my screen. Oh, Matt, it is telling me host disabled screen sharing. So can you help me with that one?
Sorry about that. You should be good now.
Awesome. Thank you. I've been telling my students, I'm still learning Zoom, and I have a strong feeling that the day I finally figure out all the little nuances and everything is the day I'm no longer going to need it. All right, here we are. Okay, so the title of this talk is Un-American, the Haze Code, the Blacklist, Censorship, and Representation. And I am, again, your guide. My name is Liz Derrington. I am a lecturer in Washburn's English department. And this is just sort of a little hobby horse of mine. Just really interested in mid-century film history, particularly, you know, the golden age of Hollywood, and LGBTQ rights and representations. So over the next 90 minutes, I'm going to be presenting a synopsis of 20th century Hollywood and LGBTQ plus history, with a focus on the 1920s to the 1960s. I'll also discuss the actions of the House Un-American Activities Committee and how those actions and the environment and hostility they created led to the Hollywood Blacklist. So I originally started putting this together, this presentation together, a little over a year ago. I was working on it with Spring 2020's WUMester topic. So there's a topic that a bunch of people across the university are working on. And last spring it was citizenship and suffrage. So I had that in mind when I was putting this together. And so my thesis here is that several factors led to LGBTQ people in the United States being excluded from full civic participation and full cultural participation. And thus altogether, Hollywood was reinforcing these policies that established individuals who exhibited gender inversion or engaged in homoerotic behavior as either outside of or degraded within citizenship. In other words, people who were queer in some way, gay, lesbian, bi, and then trans, gender nonconforming, were not given the full rights and privileges of citizenship, even if they were technically US citizens. So that's the general overarching idea I'm working with here. So before I dig into the synopsis of the history, I wanted to take a little bit of time to define some terms to make sure we're all on the same page about a number of these things. So first, when I say Hollywood, I'm using it as shorthand, or a metonym, if you want to get technical about it, for the US motion picture industry. So based in the region of Los Angeles, California, called Hollywood, at least at the time. So Hollywood is shorter than the US motion picture industry and punchier, I would say too. I'm going to bring up the Haze Code. It's in fact in the title. So this is a nickname for the motion picture production code as it was established, or it was established in 1930. And it was so named for Will Haze, who was the first president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, which was established in 1922. In 1945, that was renamed the Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA. Possibly, that's still what I'm inclined to call it, even though it was renamed again a couple years ago to just the Motion Picture Association, MPA. So this is an organization, a trade organization among the studios, and they put together this code. I'll explain it more in detail a little bit later, but they established it so that all engaged in the making of sound pictures might have a commonly understandable and commonly acceptable guide in the maintenance of social and community values in pictures. So, translated, reading between the lines, what they were basically doing and saying here is that rather than having the government step in and censor Hollywood's films, Hollywood preferred to just censor itself. We're going to have this internal code that is going to shape the content that we're producing so that we will maintain control, both financially and content-wise, over our material. So that was the idea there. So what's The Blacklist? The Blacklist is a crime thriller series on NBC, debuted in 2013 and stars James Spader. Oh, okay, not that Blacklist. How about this one? The Blacklist is an annual list of the most liked unproduced screenplays of that year. The annual lists are aggregated using votes from film executives working in the film industry. It was originated by Franklin Leonard in 2005. A lot of really popular, powerful screenplays have been listed on the Blacklist, made into films that have won Oscars. Oh, but that's probably not what I'm talking about either, is it? However, there's a connection here, at least. The idea was that Leonard wanted to subvert the cultural metaphor that Black equals bad. He says, I wanted to stick my finger in the eye of that idea. But he also wanted to take a swipe at the infamous McCarthy-inspired Blacklist, which killed the careers of screenwriters suspected of being communists, with the idea that what if there was a blacklist that people wanted to be on? So that points me to the actual blacklist I'm talking about here, the Hollywood Blacklist. This is the term, I'm quoting critic and writer Karina Longworth here. This is the term we use for the era when hundreds of actors, writers, and other artisans in the film industry were fired, denied employment, exiled from their communities, forced to leave the country in order to make a living, and in some cases even jailed due to the perception that these individuals had ties to communism. This peaked roughly 1947 to 1957. It's worth noting that a lot of the people who were on the blacklist in various ways, or there was also sort of a gray area, a gray list, people who weren't officially on any lists, but were still sort of given the side eye by employers. Some of them did indeed have ties to communism, but a lot of them didn't. So it was all based on suspicion and implication. But again, we'll dig more into that in a little bit too. Censorship. This is one of those terms that it's not actually that difficult to define, but everybody seems to have a different definition. So I wanted to be transparent and specific about the definition I'm using here. So it's the suppression of words, images, or ideas that are offensive. That's the ACLU's definition. The Oxford US Dictionary gives us the suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, etc., that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. And that, I dig that one. That one's going to be pretty relevant as we go along. So I wanted to bring up representation. That's the last term that I use in the title here. So when I talk about representation, for example, when I talk about queer representation, that's I've titled the class queer representation in the past. When we talk about representation of different kinds of people, of different racial diversity and body type diversity and all of that, we're just talking about portraying the diversity of humanity on the screen. And so I wanted to show you this brief video that's put together. It was put together for PBS NewsHour by young people, by teenagers working with the NewsHour student reporting labs. And I like their style.
Whenever I see someone that's...
Sorry, did I share my sound? I'm just gonna...
Yeah, you shared your sound.
I did, okay.
I got you, Liz.
Awesome. Let's try this again.
like my race or that believes the stuff I believe, it kind of makes me feel more included in that.
If you don't see yourself being represented in some type of social media or some type of movie or some type of TV show, I don't know, it just makes you feel like, why don't I see anybody like me? Kind of like brings your self-esteem down almost.
For my entire life, whenever me and my family would see somebody in hijab on TV, we'd all be freaking out because we never ever saw somebody that looked like us on TV.
All the media really represents us with is Raj from Big Bang Theory or Apu from Simpsons. So I think they could probably do a better job with depicting Indian people or even like brown women.
Movies that I see myself in would probably be Pocahontas, because I am Native American and I don't really see myself represented in many other movies or TV shows.
I also see myself in Halsey as a girl who's bi. She, has short hair kind of like me. She represents herself more masculine, and so I see myself in that also.
I feel like a bunch of movies in the past few years, well, for decades actually, have misrepresented Asian Americans.
If you see the same thing over and over again about this one race or something, you're gonna eventually start thinking that all of them are like that,
I would love for it to become normal for other races to be equally as represented as white people.
If you see someone on the screen that looks like you or acts like you might be inspired by them to do what they can do, or maybe be like them when you grow up.
Without that kind of representation or that kind of connection with the character, how are you supposed to know who you are?
We all live together and we shouldn't be all left out. So everybody should be included on anything we do.
All right, so that speaks a little bit to where I'm coming from and why I feel like diverse representation in media is important. And I wanted to highlight a couple of the points there that, let me stop sharing for a moment here. All right, so a couple of points that I wanted to dig into a little bit there. The idea that representation can allow young people to, and maybe not so young people, but can allow people to figure out who they are, dig into their own identities more, as well as it has some positive potential, but it also has negative potential in the sense that if all of the images we see of a particular kind of people, especially people who are marginalized in some way, it looks the same if it's always Black women are maids and Black men are thugs, and Raj from Big Bang Theory and Apu is a particular way, and gay men are sissies, and gay women are butch, et cetera, et cetera. If we have these stereotypes constantly reinforced through media, that does harm in a variety of ways. That said, something that I regularly ask when I touch on representation in my classes is always, which is worse, bad representation or no representation? Ideally, we wouldn't have to choose, right? But that's often a question when it comes to Hollywood in the 20th century. Those were often the choices that people who fell under the LGBTQ umbrella had. That's what they had to choose from. Well, you either get no representation or you get bad representation. Take your pick. And so could go on, but I'll pause there and not distract myself from my task at hand. All right, so getting back into things. All right, so the task at hand, digging into 20th century Hollywood and LGBTQ history. So looking at parallels, working through what was going on, building up to the Hollywood Blacklist, the Haze Code, and how there's not technically overlap there, sort of depending on how you define it, but they're both doing a lot of the same things to exclude particular kinds of people. So where we begin, so probably I don't need to tell a lot of the people paying attention to this, but so film as a medium develops in the late 19th century. And so for its entire existence, but in particular, these first 2 decades plus, it's especially, there's a lot of experimentation. It is both an art and a technology. So what can it be used for? Even just within storytelling, how do we want to use this to tell stories? Are we just going to treat it like another version of a play where, we have the camera set up and we basically just do the play in front of the camera? Or are there other ways we can play with this new technology? So I wanted to show you a brief clip from an early film from 1909. This is called A Panicky Picnic. I watched the clip and then foolishly did not reset it for myself. So bad job, Liz, of 3 hours ago. But so just to get a feel for some potential here. So I want to tell you in advance, this is kind of creepy. So what's going on here, this group of friends, they go out for a picnic and things go wrong. Bugs show up I decided not to show you the bugs. It's pretty creepy. But then they go to this sort of cabin in the woods to stay, and hijinks ensue. All right. So again, just a bit of flavor for some of the possibilities we can see in early film. I found that particular bit intriguing because it shows a lot of innovation right off the top. And it's also incredibly creepy. And I'm trying to imagine getting into the mindset of someone who 1909, probably, I would say there's a significant chunk of the people who are getting to see that film have never seen a film before. I feel like that would terrify me. I mean, I get pretty spooked anyway, but so again, there's some consideration of what this medium is, what it can do, what it should do, which leads up to a Supreme Court case that is decided in 1915, Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio. The Supreme Court determines that the Ohio State Constitution's free speech protections do not apply to motion pictures. So First Amendment stuff doesn't, the First Amendment, free speech, all of that, that's not, film is something else. So states begin to establish censorship boards accordingly. The first one was New York in 1921. So there's this idea of, okay, there's this new art / technology, this medium, and we don't really know what to do with it. We don't know what it's capable of entirely. We don't know what people are going to do with it, but we know it has some worrisome potential. So we're going to be set up to censor, again, eliminate content we are uncomfortable with in various ways from it. In response, or sort of as a parallel development, again, the MPPDA, later the MPAA, later the MPA, is formed in 1922. So again, this is a trade organization representing the major studios. I believe there were 6 at that point. The first president is former Postmaster General Will Haze, who issued a plea for the public to stand behind and help the motion picture producers in their efforts to maintain a clean moral tone in film productions. So again, that's the idea. The conflict here is the government wants to step in and censor our media products. We would rather they not do that. We would rather have control over them ourselves. Also wanted to point out, studios have this setup of what we would now call vertical integration. They own everything from, they have writers and actors on contracts. So they control the beginning of the productions of the films to the end, they often owned printing. They could print the film, and they owned the theaters where the films were shown. So they had control over the entire production chain and then distribution chain as well, which was awesome for them. They had just complete creative control. And again, they didn't want to concede any of this, to cede any of this control over to the government. Not so great for a lot of the other people involved. Everything from what pops into my head is Judy Garland's stories about her mistreatment at the hands of the studio executives. Lots of actors from the era have who were contract players have not dissimilar stories. It could be tough for writers, it could be tough for the directors. There was a lot of, as you can probably imagine, when executives have that much control, it's often less great for the people down at the bottom. So this is a contemporary political cartoon for when former Postmaster General Will Haze was diving into the movie industry to rescue Hollywood from its sea of real trouble. So notice there's film scandal, Hollywood film scandal, murder, dope parties. I'm not actually sure what Taylor is referring to, but Vice. So this feeling that there was this feeling that Hollywood was this den of vipers is the phrase that comes to mind. It's this pit of vice. It's corrupt and licentious, all of the bad things. And so Will Haze, who incidentally is a staunch Catholic, is going to come in and clean things up. Though I think this is calling into question exactly how well he'll be able to do so. But we move forward further into the 1920s, and we see a fairly quick shift from silent films to sound films. So everything up until 1927, the sound was separate from films. So the films were silent, they were visual medium in that sense. But May 1927, The Jazz Singer comes out, the first major sound film. And unlike with the shift from black and white to color, that took decades for the majority of films to become color films. Again, completely the opposite with the shift from silent films to sound films. The first major sound film comes out in May 1927. In August 1929, so just a little over 2 years later, the last fully silent film made by a major studio was released. So very quick transition, at least in the grand scheme of things. And this brought certain things to a head. We're also, so, there's the roaring 20s going on in the background. There's a lot of, liberated women and, driving cars, all that stuff. Young people being free. And so into this mix comes the sound film. And so Jesuit priest, Father Daniel A. Lord, who ultimately had a hand in shaping the motion picture production code, he said, silent smut had been bad. Vocal smut cried to the censors for vengeance. So that's all the background to the Haze Code. That's all the buildup. So I want to pause here and present a question for brief potential discussion. My idea in originally planning this, obviously, again, that's pre-pandemic, I wanted to have a little bit more discussion, conversation around these topics. So I've had to pivot a little bit, but wanted to take a pause point here. And I'd love to know just if everyone would just sort of imagine for a moment that you are a filmmaker or a studio executive in Hollywood during the 1920s. All this is going on. There's the 1915 court case. Can you imagine how you might go about trying to address these calls for censorship, crying to the censors for vengeance, while also maintaining your autonomy? I have no idea if this is going to work, but if you have ideas, I'm all ears.
Well, I can throw out one, Liz. Self-censorship is one of the devices that goes into this mix.
Right. Obviously, definitely. Yeah. Okay. We know people want censorship, or, there's that potential. We don't want the government doing it, so we'll do it ourselves. Yeah. All right. And indeed, that's where we ended up. Sorry, I'm trying to find my notes. Please bear with me for a moment. Technical difficulties.
You're doing great. I just thought I'd break in and let everyone know, if you are watching, I know several of you are watching on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. If you write your questions there, I can deliver them to Liz here in the Zoom. Or if you want to join discussion.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I apparently very wisely closed my notes at some point and don't know what I did with them. But that's okay. I got this. All right. So as Tom very rightly said, I'm gonna share my screen again. So with these potentially conflicting impulses, the answer is, yeah, okay, we don't want you to censor us, so we'll do it ourselves. So the Motion Picture Production Code is then adopted and ratified by the MPPDA in 1930. The code delineates its underlying principles, such as no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it, and correct standards of life shall be presented on the screen. So again, we want to display a particular image of what life ought to be like, how people ought to live their lives, and have it be morally upstanding. So there's a whole list. Bear with me for a moment. There it is. Okay. So there's a whole list of topics that are covered. So we've got particular applications under the categories of crimes against the law, sex, vulgarity, obscenity, dances, profanity, costume, religion, national feelings, titles, and repellent subjects. So all of these various things that are included under this umbrella of specific instructions about what should be included, what should not be included. So 2 points under sex that are worth noting here. quote, "Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationship are the accepted or common thing." And quote, "Sex perversion or any inference to it is forbidden." So you might have noticed there hasn't been, so this was titled a timeline of major events, or it was history, film history, and LGBTQ history in the 20th century. Haven't mentioned queer people a whole bunch. There was a lot of this sort of, well, if we just don't talk about it, maybe it'll go away. Maybe it doesn't exist if we don't acknowledge it. We can't allow people to think that this might be normal. And indeed, a lot of people spent a lot of time not even thinking about it. It doesn't even exist. However, at the time, there are absolutely people all over the world, right? But there are people in Hollywood with solid careers who are not straight. So I just wanted to bring up one example. This is William Haynes, Billy Haynes. He was under contract at MGM for a while. He had a solid career as an actor in Hollywood in the 1920s. And people knew he was gay. He met and moved in with his life partner, Jimmy Shields, in 1926, and they were ultimately together for 47 years. So, committed relationship. They basically called themselves married, but of course they couldn't get married at the time. And Haynes faced pressure to pretend, to play a particular role in his private life as well as in his career. And basically the story goes that he was given an ultimatum of marrying a woman to make sure, to keep up appearances and send the message that, again, in relation to that sex thing, that the part of the code that addresses sex, that low forms of sex relationship should not be treated as accepted or common. Again, there was these images to uphold, and so instead he left Hollywood. He stayed with Jimmy, and like I said, they were married for nearly 50 years. They became interior designers, very successful in that career. So turned out okay for Billy, but I think there's a certain temptation to believe that somehow queerness, gayness is a relatively recent invention, but it's not. It's just we're increasingly being able to talk about it. So not a ton of mention of it up until a certain point. So back to the code. We have the pre-code era. It's slightly confusing because for the most part, the code existed during this period. Again, in March 31st, 1930 is when it's officially printed. But it wasn't being enforced. There was no mechanism yet for how to enforce it. So it existed, but nobody was really doing anything about it. So there's this period in the early 30s where it wasn't, I don't know if I'd say anything goes was quite where it was, but you can find tons of films in this era that contain at least one of the elements the code made taboo. So there's sexual innuendo, there are interracial relationships, there's profanity, illegal drug use, promiscuity, sex work, infidelity, abortion, intense violence, so on and so forth, and references to homosexuality. Not always, it's still the 1930s, so there's still implication, there's still a little bit holding things back, but especially once the code started being enforced, sort of spoiler alert, a lot of this went away. So I wanted to show you a couple of brief clips from a couple of pre-code films. So the first is called Call Her Savage. It's a film that starred Clara Bow. And so she's a character who has hired a gigolo, and it gets complicated, but she has asked him to bring her to a dive, someplace seedy. So this is the place where he brings her.
And go dashing up and down the hall. If a sailor in pajamas I should see, I know he'd scare the life out of me. And on a great big battleship you'd like to be, working a chambermaid as
So I wanted to pause here, just, well, basically going to finish up here. So basically this is a 1930s gay bar. There are a couple of women here in the foreground who are sitting together, and one of the women is smoking, which is often a signal of a subtle signal of women who didn't hew to particular gender roles. There also, it's obviously not great resolution here, but there are men sitting with men. It's pretty clear, and would have been pretty clear to the audience at the time, what's going on here. So, but like hijinks ensue once our main characters arrive here. Another film, Queen Christina, starred Greta Garbo, 1933. This is historical fiction based on the Queen of Sweden, and a Queen of Sweden who, I don't know the history terribly well, wanted to remain a bachelor, quote unquote, maybe. But so this is a scene from that film.
Eva, come in.
Now, don't dally, Your Majesty. You have a busy day.
Morning, Eva. What are you doing up so early? I couldn't sleep. That means you're either happy or unhappy. Which is it? Happy. I'm glad. And what makes you so happy? Oh, no reason. How wonderful to be happy for no reason.
Let's go for a sleigh ride.
I can't now.
Oh, why not?
Ambassadors, treaties, councils.
How boring.
But we'll go afterward, Eva.
Oh, you always say that. But at the end of the day, you're never free to go anywhere. You're surrounded by musty old papers and musty old men, and I can't get near you.
Today, I'll dispose of them by sundown, I promise you. And we'll go away for 2-3 days in the country. Oh. Wouldn't you like that?
Oh, I'd love it.
The French ambassador, Monsieur Chanou, is waiting in the council chamber.
There they begin. Countess, you're dismissed. Run along.
All right. So again, subtle there, right? But you still have a more than perhaps just affectionate relationship between these two women. Queen Christina, as played by Garbo, is wearing men's clothing. And, no one was, well, I shouldn't say no one. The majority was not especially fussed about it. However, then we get to 1934, and the decision is made to actually enforce the code. So they establish a method of enforcement. Basically, the Production Code Administration is established. And with that, there's a requirement that all films released on or after July 1st, 1934, have to obtain a certificate of approval from the Production Code Administration before they can be released. And remember that tight control that the studios had over the entire process. So they've got that vertical integration. So they control the creation and the distribution of films. So it was possible to go around this, to try to get your film out there without a certificate of approval that you have indeed followed all the rules and regulations of the code. But good luck getting it distributed. So significant challenge there. Also at this time in 1934, Joseph Breen is appointed head of the Production Code Administration. And under his eye, enforcement of the production code became notoriously rigid. So just very strict about how these rules are applied. Breen was a prominent, again, Roman Catholic layman who had worked in public relations, and so again, just very strict, and because of the control that the studios had, it was very difficult to get around these dictates. Meanwhile, not meanwhile, time goes on, films are doing their thing. And then we get to World War I, World War II even. So in the interim, one example of the way that the code is enforced is part of its idea. One of the ideas presented is that caution should be exercised in showing foreign governments in negative lights. So, for example, there was discussion of perhaps making a film about the atrocities happening in Germany, but that would put a national government in a negative light, so can't have that. That was in like the late 30s, I believe. I want to say 39, but so that's an example of how it was applied. It also had arguably some effect in shaping films like Casablanca, and some of the references to Rick and Ilsa's relationship. The implications are generally very clear, especially to contemporary viewers, I think. But again, how their adulterous relationship had to follow particular guidelines in order to meet with the code's regulations. So again, then, World War II. So US gets involved at the end of 1941, and then up through the end of the war, there's a great deal of Hollywood-produced propaganda that explicitly demonstrates the ways that film can be used to send messages that shape public opinion and the sense of what is in the public's best interests. And so I'm going to show you a very brief clip of a particular bit of propaganda. So this is Der Führer's Face from 1943. It's Walt Disney Productions. Donald Duck has a nightmare in which he's in Nazi Germany, and hijinks ensue. I feel like maybe that should have been the title of this presentation, but it's going to get darker after. Well, it's already pretty dark. Anyway, so it was incredibly popular at the time. It won an Oscar for Best Animated Short Film. Saying that it hasn't aged well is an insult to beer that's gone skunky and wine that's gone vinegary. It's a lot. I don't recommend it. In particular, one of the points that stands out is, so in the short film, there's the Axis powers. So you get Hitler and Goebbels and Mussolini and Tojo. And Hideki Tojo his depiction is super racist. And he's playing the sousaphone for some reason, which I just sort of found fascinating. But wait, there's more. So I was originally gonna show a slightly longer clip, but I couldn't justify it. There's too much that I can't stand behind. So I'm gonna show you 4 seconds of it. But I think they're a not insignificant 4 seconds, obviously, since I'm doing it. But, all right, so leading up to this, the sort of, it's set to a novelty song, Der Führer's Face, or at least at the beginning, that, it's talking about how we're the master race, and it's the 4 figures I named earlier as this sort of silly band. Again, Tojo is playing the sousaphone. This is Mussolini. He's playing the drums, or I guess the drum singular. But so leading up to this point, there's the question, are we Supermen? The answer, yes, we are Supermen. So here we go.
Yahweh is the Superman. Super duper Superman.
I know that goes by fast, but that sissification, if you will, of Goebbels there just really stood out to me in the sense that, so we are mocking, it's mocking our enemies here. And in particular, by mockingly having them in a, again, silly, feminized, sissy way, talk about being Supermen. So there we have that. But again, the larger point here is, again, thinking about film as propaganda, talking about the power it can have, the power Hollywood can have to shape public opinion and have some impact on society. This is an important element of that feeling. So moving on, getting back into this point of the upcoming fear of communism. So I wanted to bring in, again, going all the way back to the Blacklist, which is coming, I promise. Some of the people who ended up on the Blacklist had absolutely nothing to do with communism. Some of the people did. And I wanted to bring in this is the sort of sales pitch of the Communist Party of the USA at the time. So this is around 1944. Not sure exactly, but the constitution of the party at the time, it says that it is carrying forward the traditions of Jefferson, Payne, Jackson, and Lincoln through a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Sound familiar? It's abolition of all exploitation of man by man, nation by nation, and race by race, striving toward a world without oppression and war, a world of brotherhood of man. Sound like fairly noble goals. I'm fascinated that they included Jackson in that mix, but so again, that idea of a world without oppression, ending exploitation, a lot of, because of those associations, a lot of the people who ended up on the blacklist were people, or at least who ended up under investigation, were people who were interested in civil rights, who were working toward racial equality, things like that. So this idea of, the Communist Party at the time is saying, hey, this is what we want to be associated with, and that's a good thing. And not long after, that gets flipped. And there are people who say, okay, this is what the Communist Party supports, so that's a bad thing. So let's see, one other contextual bit from the time, from the era. So a point that was a piece of legislation that had a great deal of impact after World War II was the GI Bill. We see, for example, higher education. There's a boom there because it allows, the GI Bill allows soldiers to go get higher education. However, the VA in 1945 issued a policy barring GI Bill benefits to any soldier who had been administratively discharged as undesirable because of homosexual acts or tendencies. So if the military found out you were gay and kicked you out, you don't get any of those GI Bill benefits. So again, explicitly excluding this group of people from full civic participation. So after World War II, during World War II, the USSR and the US are allies. Not long after the Cold War begins, and there's tension, to put it mildly. And the suspicion, I mean, again, this is 2 years after the end of World War II, but already there's this sort of, I don't know, backlash, I guess, to that spirit of cooperation. That idea, again, there's the draw that communism might have had is suddenly seen with suspicion. Even things like opposing fascism, which seemed pretty straightforward during World War II. There were accusations that there were people who were agitating against fascism during World War II, but they were called prematurely anti-fascist. So that's a whole thing. So we get into this environment of, because communism is associated with the USSR and because we're no longer trusting what's going on with the USSR, anyone who's linked to communism must be suspect. So we get into the Red Scare, this idea of that again, we have to be afraid of people who might have secret communist loyalties, and they're going to be subversive and destroy our way of life in the US. So as part of that buildup, so 1947, President Truman issues Executive Order 9835, which established procedures for the administration of an employees' loyalty program in the executive branch of the government. And one possible indicator of disloyalty was membership in, affiliation with, or sympathetic association with particular organizations, read communist organizations. And that's the year that the House Un-American Activities Committee begins subpoenaing people working in Hollywood alleged to have ties to communism. 10 men when they're subpoenaed, invoke their they invoke the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and refuse to answer the questions. The questions are, the key, sort of the question was, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And then related questions from there. So there are 10 men from Hollywood who refuse to answer the committee's questions, and they become known as the Hollywood 10. And they're held in contempt by the committee. That takes a while to actually go through that legal procedure. But their inability to get work in Hollywood is basically immediate. So again, they are put on a blacklist, a list saying, these people are subversive and you should not hire them. And it escalates from there. It expands out, and there are various pamphlets that get published with lists of people saying, these are people associated in some way with communism, so you shouldn't hire them. So it ultimately ends up being hundreds of people. Some examples. So thinking about this overlap, this connection of these parallel exclusions, LGBTQ people being excluded from full civic participation through various laws, and as we'll see in a minute, so again, that GI Bill issue, there's more to come on that point, but and they can't be depicted in films. And there's some overlap here. There are LGBTQ people, I guess predominantly gay men, obviously, but or possibly bisexual, on the Hollywood Blacklist. I want to be clear that none of these men were on the list because they were gay. That didn't enter into it. It was entirely because of their political associations. It's worth noting, so Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copeland were Jewish. Langston Hughes is a Black man, so again, someone who wrote about issues of race and worked toward, or at least had, civil rights is the association there. Will Geer, he's just an actor who he was gay, he was a communist, and so he ended up on the Hollywood Blacklist. He went on to be the grandfather in the Waltons, so I saw someone referring to him as American as apple pie, and also these other things. So I actually want to pause here for a moment. Sorry, I was deciding whether or not I wanted to stop screen sharing for a moment. For any of these people, these creative people here, do you have particular associations with any of them, with their art?
I think so. Aaron Copeland, I grew up, so I was in grade school in the 60s, so a little bit later than this time period, but I can remember being exposed to his music in the public schools, especially. So it's, it's kind of phenomenal to be hearing this.
Yeah. Both, I mean, these are Bernstein and Copeland are both sort of quintessentially American composers, at least from a 21st century perspective. I wanted to, if you're not,
too, that Hughes has local roots.
Oh, of course, yeah. Langston Hughes, absolutely, yes, born in Lawrence, right?
And spent some time in Topeka as well.
Yep. Yeah, so quintessential poet, but does some work to sort of puncture the story the United States wants to tell itself sometimes about land of the free, home of the brave.
Well, also knew a lot of communists.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So again, Bernstein definitely was not explicitly communist, but did a lot of, contributed to leftist causes, things like that. But yeah, so if you don't necessarily know Copeland off the top of your head, I wanted to play just a little bit for you. Yeah, so I don't know if any of you might remember the commercial Beef, It's What's for Dinner. They used Copeland for that commercial. But so yeah, exactly. So we have just a handful. This is just a sampling of the people who were blacklisted. But again, sort of quintessential Americana right here in various ways. Bernstein, perhaps best known for the musical West Side Story. Again, talks about immigration and America. But so again, just wanted to break that out a little bit. Going on in the background at this time, 1948, Kinsey et al. Release sort of the first of his seminal books, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. This introduces the idea of, instead of gay and straight being just a binary, you're one or the other, you are heterosexual or you are homosexual. He introduces a scale that it's a spectrum. You can go from entirely straight to mostly straight to right in the middle. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, to mostly gay to entirely gay. There's actually 2 additional steps in there. But so again, introducing the idea that, hey, maybe it's more complicated. In retrospect, his methods may not have been entirely sound, but it introduces important new ideas into the discourse. And then there's another Supreme Court case, United States versus Paramount Pictures. This breaks up that monopoly, those vertical integrations, about the fact that theaters owned, or rather, studios owned their own theaters, and so had control over both production and distribution. So the court ultimately ruled against the movie studios, forcing all of them to divest themselves of their movie theater chains. This was not great news for Hollywood. And it's possible that this had some influence on the response, or on the blacklisting, on this idea of, oh, we have to keep communists out of our system so that we can stay popular, so that we can keep making money, because we can't rely on this distribution chain anymore. So I don't feel like I know quite enough about it to make that, to assert that was part of the thinking. Who knows if they even knew what they were thinking at the time, but it's an important detail going on in the background. A couple things of significance in 1950. One is that the Mattachine Society is founded. This is what was referred to at the time as a homophile society. It's a collection of gay men who originally they had, or at least some folks involved may have had more radical ideas, but ultimately their goals were just assimilation, just acceptance. We are human beings. We are part of this society. We just want a normal life like the rest of you. Meanwhile, there is a Senate committee on expenditures in executive departments, led by Senator Clyde Hoey, often referred to as just the Hoey Committee, and it releases its report on the investigations that it's been doing into the employment of homosexuals and other sex perverts in government. This report posits the idea that not only are gay people, and I'm going to use gay as just a shorthand for gay and lesbian or people who weren't straight, because as you can probably imagine, the thinking around this subject was not especially nuanced at the time. And of course, they always use homosexual or just perverts. So the idea was that there probably were people of this sort working in the federal government, and they probably should not be. Partly because they were perverted, and so just not right in a variety of ways, and so suspicious in that respect. But also because they were prominent targets for blackmail. Someone could blackmail them and manipulate them, threaten to expose them as homosexual, cause them to lose their jobs, so manipulate them in that way. And so they were a point of vulnerability within the government. So that was probably going to need to be addressed. Sort of ongoing, in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association lists homosexuality as a mental disorder in their first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM. Relatedly, on sort of a similar note, there was a prohibition barring aliens affiliated with psychopathic personality. This is enacted in 1952. Sort of with that first bullet point in mind, as a way of explicitly preventing immigrants who were LGBTQ, etc., from entering or remaining in the country. So again, that exclusion from the United States, from citizenship in a literal sense here, you can't sit with us. And another, meanwhile, now for something completely different, another Supreme Court case. In this case, the Supreme Court just determines that the First Amendment protections do indeed apply to film, reversing their 1915 decision. So the government can't censor film after all. Does apply, film is indeed free expression, and so should not be, prior restraint does not apply here. So that report mentioned earlier, that ultimately builds up to what's called the Lavender Scare. In 1953, President Eisenhower issues executive order, I don't know how people say the numbers in these 10450, 10,450. At any rate, it charges the heads of federal agencies with investigating federal employees to determine whether they pose security risks, and expands the definitions and conditions used to make such determinations. in other words, the effect is that thousands of people who were already employed by the US government lost their jobs because they were gay or lesbian or gender nonconforming in particular ways. Let's see. Yes, under the order, thousands of LGBTQ applicants were barred from federal employment. So new employees, if they did a background check and found out, oh, actually, your neighbor says you're gay, nope, you don't get this government job. And then during this period, so this is the year of the executive order, but the Lavender Scare lasts roughly, again, kind of parallel to the Blacklist. So it's 47 to 61-ish. During that time, over 5,000 federal employees were fired under suspicions of being homosexual. So we get at the time, Republican National Committee chairs Gabrielson says, sexual perverts who have infiltrated our government in recent years were perhaps as dangerous as the actual communists. Again, they could be easily blackmailed and were thus a security risk. So again, this exclusion from public service in this way, they're excluded, LGBTQ people are excluded from, can't get VA benefits, can't immigrate to the US, can't work in government, so excluded from full civic participation, and can't see themselves represented in Hollywood films, can't work in Hollywood and be open about one's sexuality. If you want to be an actor, you're probably going to marry a woman and pretend to be straight. So that's where we're at by the mid 1950s. So again, sort of, and also 1953, Kinsey's second book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, comes out. So again, expanding the discourse around sexuality. And sort of the women's answer to the Mattachine Society, the daughters of, I always look this up and I always forget, Bilitis. That group is founded in 1955. So this is from one of their early newsletters, stating that their purpose is promoting the integration of the homosexual into society. Again, assimilation, acceptance, not radical, at least certainly not by our contemporary standards. So again, there's still forward motion, even as there's significant difficulty being presented. So for various reasons, by the late 1950s, the Blacklist starts to wind down. Part of that is probably so we've got the House Un-American Activities Committee in the House of Representatives. There was counterpart over in the Senate, Joseph McCarthy. Senator Joseph McCarthy was, this is often referred to as the McCarthy era, McCarthyism. He was kind of a ringleader, if you will. But by the mid-50s, people are starting to question him. He gets censured by the Senate, and he dies in 1957. So that took some of the wind out of the sails of the movement. And then basically just for various and sundry reasons, people decided they just weren't going to pay attention to the Blacklist anymore. They started hiring people again who had been blacklisted. So it just kind of starts to wind back down. At the same time, in part because films have to increasingly compete with television, the enforcement of the Haze Code begins to loosen. It's revisited in 1956. Areas are rewritten to accept subjects such as interracial relationships, adultery, and sex work. I want to point out that I've changed some of the language here. The specific language that the code uses, for example, is miscegenation. So the idea of Black people and white people having having mixed babies. But it's not a fun word to say. So, so again, there's some reconsideration of, okay, maybe we could be a little bit more flexible. Again, the reign of Joseph Breen has ended, so maybe we can chill out about some of this. Though, even by the late 1950s, it's a fascinating period, to say the least. So, so Tennessee Williams was obviously a gay Southern playwright who had great success on Broadway. And a good number of his plays were adapted for film, beginning with the immensely popular Streetcar Named Desire in 1951. So the end of the 50s, for whatever reason, people decide to adapt a couple of his plays, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and Suddenly Last Summer, both of which have gay themes, if you will. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Brick, the character that's played by Paul Newman, basically was in love with his best friend, or his best friend, well, it's complicated, but he's an alcoholic, and part of why he drinks is so that he can live with himself in various directions. So the film adaptation I really love it, in spite of the fact that it's been sanitized somewhat. The implications are all still there. But there's sort of this standing question of, Paul Newman is married to Elizabeth Taylor, but won't have sex with her. And gosh, I mean, it's because he's an alcoholic, but why is he an alcoholic? Who can say? And I'm so fascinated by it because it's such a fascinating artifact of its era. And then the next year, another Tennessee Williams play, Suddenly Last Summer, didn't fare much better. It also has homosexual themes, also stars Elizabeth Taylor, but was sanitized. A lot of the explicit references from the play are softened. The implications are still there, but there's still a lot of plausible deniability. So I had hoped to find you clips to play and compare and contrast them to some excerpts from the plays themselves. But I had already anticipated that I would be running out of time at this point, but worth checking out. And also, again, just examples of how a step forward, a step back. But then, a couple of years later, in 1961, the MPAA revises the production code to allow homosexuality on screen, so long as it is portrayed with care, discretion, and restraint. However, it clarified the next year that sexual aberration could be suggested, but not actually spelled out. So in this period of the 50s into the 60s, there are increasing examples of, we see a lot more, it's less of an absence than it was before. There are gay people and lesbian people and gender nonconforming people and so on in films, but often there's a lot of, okay, we'll include them, but we'll punish them. You know, they get killed, they're the villains, they take their own lives. It's a pretty messy era. But it ultimately leads to 1970 is the first mainstream film where all of the characters, well, almost all of the characters are gay. At least all of the main characters are gay. And then there's so much more after that, but at least insofar as full exclusion, I can wrap that part up there. And then, so the other thing about the Haze Code is that by the late 60s, it's no longer being enforced at all. And by, I believe, 1968, the rating system that is mostly like what we would recognize today is proposed and then goes into effect in November of 1968. And so that the idea there is that film restrictions would lessen under these ratings, and they're just sort of a warning to parents and film goers and all of that here is the content you can expect from this film. In practice, that turns out that's less objective than it might purport to be. But that's, you know, it sort of ends not with a bang but a whimper. It just sort of, a lot of this just kind of fades away. However, obviously still a lot of the trauma and damage done by both the Blacklist, the Lavender Scare, the Haze Code, that all still has effects, and to a certain extent we're still talking about the Blacklist. There are still, I'm sure, financial implications, certainly still social implications. And then, there's certainly a lot to say about queer representations and how, to a certain extent, maybe we're still playing catch up. A lot of, again, continuing to come back to those questions of representation and what can we expect? What can we ask for? Can we do better? Maybe, probably. So here's hoping, right? So that is my time. If you would like to talk to me about this further, I would love that. So hit me up. Feel free to send me an email, liz.derrington, DERRINGTON @washburn.edu. Otherwise, in the words of Bill and Ted, be excellent to each other and have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy the rest of the festival and take good care.
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. I learned a lot, actually. That was wonderful.
Cool.
Well, I have to jump on to the next one. Producing It's a Woman's Game, which is going to be really,
Nice.
really wonderful, by a PGA affiliated producer here in Topeka. So if you're interested in that, check us out here in about 1 minute.
Right
Thanks
on.
again, Liz.